Hello and welcome back to another video where I cover the last developments over the past 6 months. We have mainly seen large Russian offensive operations, specifically around the Kursk area in the north, and the Russian offensive operations within the Donetsk region from the southwestern outskirts to the northern outskirts of it, while the remaining sections of the front lines really have not seen that many changes. The Ukrainians have launched arbitrary defensive operations and counterattacks here and there across the front line without much success. The Ukrainians are mainly aiming to slow down or stop Russian offensive operations rather than regaining territory at this point. The Russians have been continuously launching offensive operations since the end of the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023. Since then, the Russians have been launching offensive operation after offensive operation, mainly centered around the Donetsk region. They also launched a significant counterattack after the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, which managed to capture approximately 1,100 square kilometers. The Russians managed to recapture the majority of this during the month of March, where they launched a large-scale counteroffensive to regain full control of it. Since then, they've been launching offensive operations into the Sumy region as a part of a wider objective of creating a buffer zone along the entire Russo-Ukrainian border area. The Russians have also launched offensive operations across the Osk River line and now recently across the border into the Kharkiv region and at an additional point, which shows the increasing Russian offensive operations along the border areas to prevent the Ukrainians from launching another Kursk incursion. Therefore, although the Ukrainian Kursk incursion in and of itself did not really achieve much other than redirecting some Russian soldiers to that section of the front line, as well as holding it for quite a while. However, they still lost quite a lot of equipment and forces during that operation. Now, what did benefit them is the fact that the Russians decided to launch this wide-scale buffer zone along the entire border area. They all were already planning on making such an operation, but they are prioritizing it over other operations due to the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. At the same time, they're also putting up quite a lot of forces to demine the border area between Russia and Ukraine, the Kursk region, anywhere the Ukrainian forces were present, and the Russians set up their own minefields. However, they're mainly using North Korean soldiers and now soldiers from Laos as well to demine these areas, freeing up the Russian soldiers for the offensive operations across the border area. Now, the main focus of the Russian forces has clearly been within the Donetsk region, where they're launching 3 simultaneous offensive operations within the region, one in the Liman direction, one in the Toretsk direction, in the direction of Kashantinivka, and the area between Pokrovsk and Kashantinivka, as well as the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where the Russians have made the most advances. While the Russians have yet to abandon the Siversk section of the front line or the Chasiv Yar section, where the Ukrainians have heavy resistance facing the Russian forces. However, the Russians have been making small advances in these areas these last 6 months, where the Russians are on the outskirts of Chasiv Yar, almost gaining 100% full control over the city and starting offensive operations beyond it. And they are on the outskirts of Siversk, about to get their first foothold within the town for the first time in 3 years. The Russians are slowly improving their situation along the entire front line, where they are getting closer and closer to gaining full control over the Donetsk region itself. They are also launching these offensive operations along the border areas, widening the front line, redirecting Ukrainian forces, and spreading them out thinly for their focus in the Donetsk region to be accelerated. They have also launched some smaller offensive operations within the Zaporizhia region from the center to the west and east. The Russians now, at this point in time, control 26,566 square kilometers of the Luhansk region, or approximately 99.55% of it, 20,013 square kilometers of the Donetsk region, or approximately 75.47% of it, 20,533 square kilometers of Zaporizhia region, approximately 75.55% of it, 21,453 square kilometers of the Kherson region, which is approximately 75.38% of it, 1,322 square kilometers in the Kharkiv region, or 4.21% of it, 299 square kilometers in Mykolaiv, 260 in Sumy, 21 in Chernihiv, and 15 in Dnipropetrovsk, where the Russians have launched some smaller operations and gaining their first footholds within these regions. Speaking of the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians have started their first offensive operations into it, and this is a significant switch in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as the Dnipropetrovsk region is one of the least fortified sections of the front line as we speak right now. The Sumy regions comes in second place as the least fortified. Then the Kharkiv region in the northern section. The Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions are heavily fortified, while the Kherson region has a natural barrier as well as a serious number of fortifications that makes them much more difficult to breach through. Therefore, the main offensive focus of the Russian forces, beyond that of the Donetsk region, is going to be the Dnipropetrovsk region and the Sumy region. The Russians are interested in expanding the offensive operations outside of the Donetsk region and generally the more fortified areas due to the fact that the Ukrainians would need more soldiers to deal with such operations, that they do not have the fortifications necessary to hold back the Russians. If the Ukrainians have a trench network, they'll be able to hold back a Russian assault with just a few soldiers. Between 4 and 12 can hold back a small Russian assault group, while if they do not have this trench network, they would need tens of soldiers, if not hundreds of soldiers, to hold back a similar sized unit with a trench network and other fortifications that support them. Therefore, the less fortifications the Ukrainians have, the more soldiers are necessary to hold back the Russian forces. That means if the Russians have 100,000 soldiers in the Donetsk region, the Ukrainians could probably hold them back with 50,000 or 20,000 soldiers, compared to the Sumy or Dnipropetrovsk regions, where the Russians would have 100,000 soldiers and the Ukrainians would probably need 50 to 100,000 to hold them back and slow them down or stop them completely, in comparison to other sections of the front line where they have significant fortifications. Now, the Russians reportedly have over 100,000, somewhere near 150,000 soldiers along the border area, according to Western intelligence, and based on that, the Ukrainians would need to send over 100,000 soldiers to defend against any Russian incursion along the border area, while in the Donetsk region itself, the Russians have, within Ukraine, the Russians have over 700,000 soldiers, according to Zelensky. It is likely to be more than that because the Russians have approximately 1 million soldiers dedicated to the war in Ukraine. It could be all the way up to 850,000 soldiers. This means that the Ukrainians could have hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the southern and eastern section of the front line, but would also need to redirect over 100,000 soldiers to the northern section of the front line, which would significantly weaken the southern and eastern parts, and this allows for more significant Russian advances, especially as they capture more and more of these fortified positions, weakening the front line positions for the Ukrainians, requiring even more soldiers. At the same time, in areas such as Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, where the Russians are slowly encircling these cities in an operational encirclement, they'll be able to force the Ukrainians to redirect a lot of resources to hold the city, while also being able to target their supply lines, which would inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians, similar to the Battle of Bakhmut, following which the Ukrainian counteroffensive was significantly slowed down and weakened, which by itself delayed the Ukrainian spring offensive to the Ukrainian summer offensive. At the same time, it also was partially responsible for the failure of the Ukrainian summer offensive in 2023, which then led to the snowball of the Russian forces slowly capturing more and more of the Donetsk region, leading to the Avdiivka offensive, which led to the Pokrovsk offensive, which led to the offensive operations to the north of the city and in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, which leads to the Russian entry into the Dnipropetrovsk region, which leads to the flanking of Pokrovsk from the east and from the west, which then leads to another Bakhmut, and we can see the situation repeating itself continuously in favor of the Russians. While the Ukrainians are mostly reactive, they do not have the strength that the Russians have to shape the battlefield in their favor, as the Russians are doing. And this is why the Russians are continuing to improve their positions and capture more and more territory, while the Ukrainians are unable to establish a proper counteroffensive or new offensive operation that is able to meet the same results as they saw in Kherson and Kharkiv and the Kursk region. Even Western articles are starting to admit that the Russian objective is not to capture territory right now, but remains to be weakening the Ukrainian army, which after the weakening of the Ukrainian army, the Russians will be able to capture the territory with less losses. And this is why we're seeing the Russians launching these small offensive operations that are not very ambitious territorial goals. An example is the Russians would be able to capture Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka faster with more losses. However, what they're aiming for is the operational encirclement, which will delay the capture of the city, but will increase the casualties that the Ukrainians are taking. An example is the siege over the area here west of Toretsk, where the Ukrainian positions in Klebenbyk, Katerinivka, Novospassky, and Sherbinivka are being held by the Ukrainian forces. The Russians have established an operational encirclement of the area where they have cut off many of the supply lines, leaving just a few in a small span of territory in which the Russians have fire control over. This is to inflict as many casualties on the Ukrainians as possible, while if they closed the pocket, which they would be able to do, they would take more casualties and the Ukrainians would fight to the last man. Instead, what the Ukrainians are now being forced to is either resupply their forces, through which the Russians will continually be bombarding these reinforcements and supplies, launch a counterattack to which the Russians would be on the defensive, holding fortified positions and the high ground, which gives them the advantage, or to withdraw from the area, which again would be under fire by Russian forces. All of these leads to heavy Ukrainian casualties and the Russians sparing as many of their men and forces as possible. Continuously launching operations such as this across the front line continues to weaken the Ukrainian forces, improving the Russian positions, and thereby naturally speeding up the process towards capturing the 4 regions that they've annexed and established as a goal in their offensive. Speaking of their goals, Putin said in a telephone conversation with Trump that they would not end the war before they achieve all of their goals, which means that the Russians continue to plan to gain full control over these 4 regions. It's simply not their priority right now, as another goal they have is to destroy the Ukrainian army, which remains their primary objective since really mid-2022 or so, especially after the successful Ukrainian counterattacks in Kherson and Kharkiv, where they realized they had to degrade the Ukrainian military capabilities before they'd be able to successfully capture and hold Ukrainian territory. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.